I arrived at Unity Nexus expecting another political debate. The station was the largest structure I had ever seen. Suspended between 6 major hyperspace routes, it served as the heart of the Galactic Council. Hundreds of civilizations maintained embassies there, and on most days its corridors were crowded with diplomats, traders, and travelers. Now it was crowded with refugees. The border wars had ended 2 years earlier, but peace had not repaired the damage. Entire worlds had been devastated. Billions had lost their homes. Temporary shelters filled every available deck, and relief ships remained docked around the station's outer rings. As a journalist, I spent days interviewing survivors. Every story was different, yet they all ended with the same question. What happens now? The answer was why the council had called an emergency session. Inside the Great Chamber, thousands of representatives gathered beneath a crystal dome that revealed the stars beyond. The atmosphere felt tense long before the meeting began. Several powerful empires argued that they could no longer support growing refugee populations. Their economies were strained, resources were limited, border restrictions, they claimed, had become necessary. Others disagreed. Abandoning billions of war survivors, they warned, would create even greater instability. The debate quickly turned heated. Accusations filled the chamber. Old alliances showed cracks. Entire sectors threatened to close their borders. From the press gallery, I watched the arguments grow louder. Among the delegates sat a small human delegation. Few paid them much attention. Humanity was still new to galactic politics, and most older civilizations considered them well-meaning but inexperienced. At the time, I thought the real story would come from the great empires arguing below. I had no idea that history was about to begin with a single human voice. The debate continued for hours. By midday, the chamber had become a battlefield of words. One delegate after another stepped onto the central platform to explain why their worlds could no longer accept refugees. Economic projections filled the holographic displays above the chamber. Charts showed shrinking budgets, overcrowded cities, and strained supply networks. Compassion does not create resources, declared a representative from the Kareth Dominion. His statement earned widespread approval. Another delegate rose immediately afterward. If we continue accepting refugees at current levels, our infrastructure will collapse within 20 years. More agreement followed. The discussion was no longer about helping survivors. It was about limiting responsibility. I sat in the press gallery, recording every speech and watching the atmosphere grow colder with each passing hour. Delegates who had once spoken of unity now spoke only of costs and burdens. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The Bayari coalition would close all refugee corridors within 6 months. Several powerful empires followed, one after another. Borders were sealed on paper before the votes had even begun. The chamber erupted into arguments. Some representatives applauded the decisions. Others openly condemned them. Speaker Valoran struggled repeatedly to restore order. For several minutes, dozens of delegates shouted simultaneously. Then a request to speak appeared on the chamber display. Humanity. A few delegates glanced toward the outer seating sections. Most seemed surprised the humans had remained silent for so long. The request was granted. The human ambassador rose from his seat and walked calmly toward the central platform. He carried no notes. No advisors followed him. Compared to the ancient leaders surrounding him, he looked almost ordinary. Whispers spread through the chamber. I heard several nearby journalists exchanging skeptical comments. Humans were respected for their humanitarian efforts, but many older civilizations viewed them as idealists. Few expected anything important from the speech. The ambassador waited until the room settled. Then he spoke. A civilization is not judged by how it treats its strongest citizens. His voice was calm but carried easily through the chamber. The hall grew quieter. It is judged by how it treats the people who have nothing left. Silence followed. Not complete silence, but enough that every delegate heard every word. The ambassador looked around the chamber. At the emperors, at the ministers, at the representatives of worlds wealthy enough to debate numbers while billions struggled to survive. We speak of refugees as burdens. We speak of costs, quotas, and limitations. His gaze remained steady. But every number on your screens is a person, a family, a survivor. For a moment, nobody interrupted him. Then the objections began. Compassion does not solve shortages. Kindness cannot govern a galaxy. Refugees create instability. Several delegates openly laughed. One representative shook his head in visible disbelief. To them, the human words sounded noble but unrealistic. The ambassador listened without reacting. And as the chamber filled once more with arguments, I found myself wondering whether anyone would remember his speech at all. I would soon learn that history rarely begins where politicians think it does. 3 days after the council session, I was assigned to cover conditions aboard Nova Harbor. At first, I considered the transfer a disappointment. Unity Nexus remained the center of galactic politics. Decisions made there affected billions of lives. Compared to the council chamber, Nova Harbor seemed insignificant. I was wrong. The industrial station orbited a gas giant near the edge of a major trade route. Most travelers only stopped long enough to refuel before continuing their journeys. Freight crews, mechanics, dock workers, and maintenance teams formed the majority of its population. Life there was simple, hard, and often overlooked. The lower districts were crowded with workers struggling to survive from one pay cycle to the next. Refugees frequently arrived seeking employment, but jobs were limited and station authorities had recently increased inspections. Many newcomers disappeared before finding stable housing. Others simply moved on. It was in one of those lower districts that I first heard about Ryan Cole. The bakery sat on a narrow corner between a repair shop and a cargo supply warehouse. The sign above the entrance was old and slightly faded, but the smell of fresh bread drew customers from half the district. Every morning before sunrise, Ryan opened his doors. Every evening he closed them long after most businesses had shut down. The routine rarely changed. Workers stopped by before their shifts. Freight crews purchased meals before departing. Mechanics gathered around small tables during breaks. The bakery was never luxurious, but it was always full. Ryan himself was surprisingly ordinary. Human, mid-30s, dark hair usually covered by a flour-stained cap. If someone passed him in a corridor, they would never guess he would one day become known across multiple star systems. When I first met him, he was carrying a tray of bread from the kitchen. "Busy morning?" I asked. He laughed. "Busy mornings are the good ones." Several customers waved as he passed. He knew nearly all of them by name. That struck me immediately. On a station housing millions, Ryan somehow remembered people. Not just regular customers. Everyone. Dock workers, repair crews, security officers, even refugees who only visited once. The bakery possessed another unusual reputation. Nobody was turned away. Nobody. If a customer lacked enough credits, Ryan quietly found a solution. A smaller meal, a delayed payment, sometimes no payment at all. He never discussed it publicly, never treated it as charity. To him, it appeared normal. As refugee inspections increased across Nova Harbor, many residents became cautious. Ryan did the opposite. Extra food appeared in storage. Blankets were stacked in a back room. Emergency supplies slowly accumulated. He never announced a reason, never made speeches. When I eventually asked why he was preparing, his answer was simple. Because difficult times are usually followed by more difficult times. Then he returned to kneading dough. At the time, neither of us knew that a young refugee named Ayla Wren was already on her way to the bakery, and that her arrival would change everything. The storm arrived shortly after sunset. Nova Harbor's outer hull groaned as powerful winds slammed against the station's shielding systems. Warning lights flashed throughout several docking sectors, and many businesses closed early. Ryan's bakery remained open. It usually did. The evening crowd had already thinned when the door finally opened. A cold gust of recycled air swept inside. I happened to be sitting near the window. reviewing notes from earlier interviews, when I saw her enter. At first glance, she looked like countless other refugees who passed through Nova Harbor every day. Young, thin, exhausted, her clothing was worn from travel, and her eyes carried the hollow look I had come to recognize after months of covering refugee settlements. She hesitated near the entrance, not because she seemed afraid, because she seemed determined not to appear desperate. Ryan noticed her immediately. "Evening," he said with his usual smile. The girl approached the counter slowly. Several customers glanced toward her before returning to their meals. No one recognized her. No one knew her story. At that moment, she was simply another stranger. "My name is Ayla Wren," she said quietly. Her voice was steady despite the obvious exhaustion. "I would like to buy a loaf of bread." Ryan nodded. "Of course." Then Ayla placed something on the counter. A medal. The object landed with a soft metallic sound that immediately drew attention from several nearby tables. It was old, military issue. Its surface was scratched and worn from years of use. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Ryan looked at the medal. Then at Ayla. "I don't have enough credits," she admitted. "This is all I have left." The bakery became unusually quiet. Even the customers seemed to understand that they were witnessing something important. Ayla kept her hand near the medal, not protecting it, reluctantly letting it go. The difference mattered. Ryan studied the object carefully. "Family heirloom?" he asked. She nodded. "It belonged to my mother." The words seemed difficult for her to say. For the first time, I noticed moisture gathering in her eyes. "She earned it during the border wars." Ryan remained silent. Ayla took a slow breath. "I only need one loaf." The storm continued to howl outside. Inside, the bakery felt completely still. I remember thinking that Ryan would probably offer a discount. Maybe accept the medal temporarily. Perhaps arrange a repayment plan. Instead, he did something none of us expected. He pushed the medal back across the counter. Ayla stared at it, confused. "You should keep that," Ryan said. Then he turned toward the kitchen. A few moments later, he returned carrying fresh bread and a bowl of hot soup. "You look hungry." Ayla blinked. "I only asked for bread." "I know." Ryan placed the meal in front of her. "Sit down." For the first time that evening, the young refugee looked completely speechless. Neither of us realized it then. But that simple act of kindness had just begun a chain of events that would eventually reach the Galactic Council itself. Ayla returned the next morning. She arrived before sunrise, just as Ryan was unlocking the bakery doors. For a moment, she stood outside as if unsure whether she belonged there. Then Ryan waved her inside. "You, early." Ayla glanced toward the kitchen. "I wanted to thank you." Ryan handed her an apron. "Great, you can start by helping with breakfast." The girl stared at the apron. "What? You said thank you. Now I am saying you can help." For the first time since entering the bakery the night before, Ayla smiled. A small smile, but a real one. That morning, she learned how to arrange bread displays. The next day she helped clean tables. By the end of the week, most regular customers recognized her. Something unusual happened during those days. People started talking to her. Not about paperwork, not about refugee status, not about inspections or permits. They simply spoke to her like a person. A mechanic named Taro showed her how cargo lifters worked. Dock workers saved her a seat during lunch breaks. Even station security officers occasionally stopped by for coffee and conversation. The bakery had always felt different from the rest of Nova Harbor. Now Ayla was becoming part of it. Slowly, Ryan learned more about her past. Her homeworld had been caught between two advancing fleets during the border wars. Entire cities were evacuated within days. Others were never evacuated at all. Ayla had lost almost everything. Her father had disappeared during the fighting. Her mother, Serena Wren, had served as a military medic. According to official records, Serena died during a civilian evacuation operation while treating wounded survivors under enemy bombardment. The medal Ayla carried was awarded after her death. It was the only thing her daughter had managed to keep. When Ryan heard the story, He said nothing for a long time. Then he quietly hung a photograph frame near the counter. It remained empty. At first, nobody understood why. Weeks passed. Business continued, yet not everyone approved of Ayla's presence. Refugee inspections had become stricter throughout Nova Harbor. Rumors spread easily in the lower districts. Some residents complained that refugees received too much assistance. Others argued that outsiders were taking jobs from station citizens. The comments usually stopped when Ryan entered the room, but they never disappeared entirely. One afternoon, I overheard a customer mutter something about another refugee living off charity. The bakery became silent. Ayla heard it. Everyone knew she heard it. Ryan calmly placed a tray of bread on the counter. Then he looked directly at the customer. "Funny thing about hard times," he said. "They can happen to anyone." The customer left shortly afterward. Ayla remained quiet for the rest of the day. But later that evening, after the last customers departed, she asked Ryan a question. "Why are you helping me?" Ryan considered the question while cleaning the counter. Finally, he shrugged. "Because somebody should." Neither of them realized that a forgotten military package was already making its way toward Nova Harbor. And inside that package waited a photograph that would change everything. The package arrived on an ordinary afternoon. At first, Ryan almost ignored it. Deliveries came to the bakery all the time. Suppliers sent invoices, customers mailed thank you notes, and freight companies occasionally dropped off shipments at the wrong address. This package was different. The sender information was incomplete. The return address belonged to an old military archive office. Ryan frowned as he carried the small box into the kitchen. Ayla was helping prepare bread dough nearby. "What's that?" she asked. "No idea." He opened the package carefully. Inside was a single folder. Nothing else. No letter. No explanation. Just a folder containing several documents and an old photograph. Ryan pulled the photograph free. The moment he saw it, he froze. Ayla noticed immediately. "Ryan?" He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the image. The photograph had clearly been taken during the border wars. Smoke filled the background. Damaged evacuation transports stood behind a group of wounded civilians. Near the center of the image, a military medic was helping injured survivors board a shuttle. The medic wore a medical insignia on her uniform, and beside her sat a badly wounded young soldier. "Ryan." Several seconds passed before anyone spoke. Ayla slowly approached the table. "What is it?" Ryan handed her the photograph. She stared at it. Then her eyes widened. The medic in the picture was instantly recognizable. Even younger, she looked exactly like the woman in the family photographs Ayla kept in her small room. "That's my mother." The words came out as little more than a whisper. Ryan nodded. "I know." Silence filled the bakery. For years Ryan had remembered only fragments of that day. The evacuation, the bombardment, the confusion, his injuries. Now the missing pieces suddenly returned. He remembered the medic who refused to leave wounded civilians behind. He remembered her carrying people to safety while explosions shook the landing zone. Most of all, he remembered waking inside an evacuation shuttle because someone had dragged him there moments before enemy fire destroyed the area. Someone had saved his life. That someone was Serena Wren. Ayla stared at the photograph. Then at Ryan. "You knew my mother?" "I didn't know her name." His voice was quiet. "But I remember her." The realization settled over both of them slowly. Years earlier, Serena Wren had saved a wounded soldier she had never met. Now that soldier had unknowingly helped her daughter. Neither act had been planned. Neither expected repayment. Yet somehow the connection had survived across years and star systems. As evening approached, customers continued arriving at the bakery. None of them knew that a single photograph had just transformed an act of kindness into something far greater. And within days, the entire station would learn Serena Wren's story, including the authorities who had just issued an order to deport Ayla from Nova Harbor. The notice arrived 2 days later. I was sitting near the front window when station security entered the bakery. 3 officers, dark uniforms, official data pads in hand. The moment they stepped through the door, conversations stopped. Customers looked up from their meals. Ryan glanced away from the counter. Ayla froze. Everyone knew why security officers visited refugee districts. The lead officer approached calmly. Ayla Wren? The young girl stood slowly. Yes. The officer activated his datapad. Under revised immigration regulations, your temporary residency status has been revoked. The words sounded cold, practiced, as though they had been spoken hundreds of times before. You are scheduled for relocation and deportation processing effective immediately. The bakery fell silent. Ayla did not argue. That was what struck me most. She simply lowered her eyes, as if she had expected this moment from the beginning. Around the room, several customers exchanged uneasy glances. No one moved. No one spoke. The officer continued. You will accompany us now. Ayla nodded once. Then she reached into her pocket. Slowly, carefully, she removed her mother's medal. The same medal she had once offered in exchange for a loaf of bread. For a moment she stared at it, then closed her hand around it. Ryan watched everything from behind the counter. The officers began moving toward her. That was when he spoke. Wait. The single word stopped everyone. The lead officer turned. This is an official matter. I know. Ryan walked from behind the counter carrying the old photograph. The one that had arrived inside the military archive package. The one showing Serena Wren during the evacuation. The one showing the medic who had saved his life. He placed it on the nearest table. Before you take her, Ryan said quietly, you should know who her mother was. Confusion spread across the room. The officer frowned. Ryan pointed toward the photograph. Years ago, during the border wars, a military medic stayed behind during an evacuation. Nobody interrupted him. She carried civilians to safety while enemy forces advanced. His voice remained calm, controlled. She rescued wounded soldiers she had never met. The bakery had become completely still. Even the officers were listening now. One of those soldiers was me. Ayla stared at him. The officer looked down at the image, then back at the young refugee. Ryan continued. Her name was Serena Wren. The room seemed to hold its breath. She died saving people. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For the first time, the officers were no longer looking at a refugee. They were looking at the daughter of a hero. And as word began spreading beyond the bakery walls, something remarkable happened. People stopped asking where Ayla came from. They started asking why the galaxy had forgotten who her mother was. By nightfall, half of Nova Harbor knew the story. By morning, the entire station would. By the following morning, the bakery was full. Not with customers, with listeners. Workers who normally grabbed breakfast and rushed to their shifts remained seated long after finishing their meals. Dock crews repeated the story to freight pilots. Mechanics shared it with cargo inspectors. Security officers carried it into briefing rooms. The story spread through Nova Harbor faster than any official announcement. A hungry refugee had entered a bakery carrying her mother's medal. A human baker had refused to take it. Later, everyone learned whose medal it was. Serena Wren, the medic who died saving civilians during the border wars. The daughter of a war hero had nearly been deported because nobody knew her name or cared enough to ask. By midday, local news networks began reporting the story. At first it appeared as a minor human interest segment. Then viewers started responding. Messages flooded station communication channels. Former soldiers shared memories of Serena's evacuation efforts. Survivors came forward with testimonies. Several claimed they were alive because Serena Wren had chosen to stay behind when others retreated. The evidence grew rapidly. Archived military records were uncovered. Witness statements surfaced. Within hours, the story transformed from a local incident into a station-wide discussion. Questions followed. Difficult questions. Why had a decorated hero's daughter been left without support? Why had she been forced to trade her last family possession for food? How many others had experienced the same treatment? By evening, Public pressure forced Nova Harbor's administration to suspend Ayla's deportation order pending review. The announcement did little to calm public interest. If anything, it intensified it. People were no longer discussing one refugee. They were discussing all refugees. The bakery became the center of attention. Journalists arrived from every district. Camera crews gathered outside. Travelers stopped simply to see the place where the story had begun. Ryan seemed deeply uncomfortable with the attention. Whenever reporters asked for interviews, he usually pointed toward the kitchen and continued working. "I just gave someone dinner," he told one journalist. "You make it sound like I saved the galaxy." But the story had already escaped Nova Harbor. Major media networks picked it up. Then interstellar news organizations. Within 3 days, broadcasts discussing Serena Wren and her daughter appeared across multiple star systems. The phrase spread with the story. Nobody knew who said it first. Perhaps a customer, perhaps a reporter, perhaps someone watching from another world. It didn't matter. Soon everyone was repeating it. She offered her last metal for bread. And a human's choice changed history. The words appeared on news feeds, discussion forums, and public broadcasts throughout the sector. Meanwhile, on Unity Nexus, members of the Galactic Council began noticing something unusual. Citizens across dozens of worlds were suddenly questioning refugee policies. And many of them were asking the same thing. If ordinary people could show compassion, why couldn't governments? For the first time since the emergency session had begun, the debate was changing. And it was changing because of a bakery. 1 week after Ayla's story became public, Unity Nexus looked very different from the day I had first arrived. The council chamber was still crowded. The same delegates still occupied the same seats. The refugee crisis had not disappeared. But the tone of the debate had changed. Every representative knew why. The story from Nova Harbor had reached nearly every major media network in civilized space. At first, many politicians dismissed it as an emotional distraction. A single refugee, a single bakery, a single act of kindness. Hardly the foundation for galactic policy. Then the public began asking questions. Questions that were far more difficult than any speech delivered inside the council chamber. How many refugees had sold family heirlooms simply to eat? How many war survivors had been denied opportunities because of regulations designed to keep them out? How many children like Ayla existed across the galaxy? Citizens demanded answers. Governments struggled to provide them. The pressure grew daily. Outside the council complex, protesters gathered beneath holographic displays showing Serena Wren's photograph. Relief organizations distributed reports documenting failures within refugee systems. Journalists uncovered dozens of similar cases. Most lacked a happy ending. The more people investigated, the worse the situation appeared. Inside the chamber, delegates found themselves defending policies that suddenly seemed impossible to justify. The Careth Dominion representative attempted to redirect the discussion toward economics. The issue remains resource allocation. Almost immediately, another delegate interrupted. The issue is whether we have forgotten our responsibilities. Several members signaled agreement. Something had shifted. The debate was no longer centered entirely on costs. Now it included morality. The human ambassador who had spoken days earlier remained unusually quiet. His words were circulating throughout the galaxy without his help. A civilization is not judged by how it treats its strongest citizens. The sentence appeared on news broadcasts, public monuments, communication feeds, even station walls. Some praised it, others criticized it. Nobody ignored it. Meanwhile, investigations into Serena Wren's military record continued. What they uncovered surprised everyone. She had saved hundreds of civilians during the final months of the border wars. Multiple evacuation operations listed her among the personnel responsible for preventing catastrophic loss of life. Several decorations had been awarded posthumously. Yet her daughter had received almost no meaningful support after the war. That discovery outraged millions. If the family of a celebrated hero could fall through the cracks, what chance did ordinary refugees have? By the end of the week, several governments announced formal reviews of their refugee policies. Others resisted, but even resistance required explanation now. The question had become impossible to avoid, and it was a question no government wanted to answer. What kind of civilization allows its heroes, children, to go hungry? For the first time, the galaxy wasn't debating refugees. It was debating itself. The pressure on the Galactic Council continued to grow. Every day brought new investigations. Every investigation uncovered another failure. News networks published reports showing overcrowded refugee settlements. Aid organizations released statistics proving that millions of war survivors still lacked stable housing. Former military personnel publicly described evacuation efforts that had been forgotten almost as soon as the fighting ended. The story of Ayla Ren had become something larger than a single event. It had become a symbol. Citizens across the galaxy demanded action. Eventually, the council could no longer avoid responding. A special session was scheduled. Representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered once more beneath the crystal dome of Unity Nexus. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different. Less certain. More uncomfortable. Many delegates understood that their previous positions were being questioned not only by political rivals but by their own populations. When the human ambassador requested the floor, nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. The chamber became quiet. The ambassador stood and looked around the assembly. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he spoke. "We did not ask for this discussion." His voice remained calm. "We did not create the refugee crisis. We did not start the border wars." The delegates listened carefully. "But we all inherited the consequences." A holographic display appeared above the chamber. Images replaced statistics. Families, children, workers, former soldiers, refugees rebuilding their lives wherever they could find an opportunity. These people are not burdens. They are survivors. The ambassador allowed the images to remain visible. They do not need pity. They need opportunity. The display changed again. Now it showed a detailed proposal. Housing initiatives, education programs, employment partnerships, joint interstellar funding agreements, transportation corridors connecting worlds willing to accept displaced populations. Practical solutions, not speeches, not slogans, plans. Earth proposes a cooperative refugee assistance network, the ambassador continued. No single civilization should bear the responsibility alone. Several delegates exchanged surprised looks. The proposal was ambitious, expensive, and far more comprehensive than many expected from a relatively young species. The ambassador concluded with a final statement. No one should have to trade their dignity simply to survive. Silence followed, not the hostile silence that had greeted humanity before. A thoughtful silence. Across the chamber, delegates reviewed the proposal. Some remained skeptical, others immediately expressed support. But for the first time since the crisis began, the discussion focused on solutions rather than restrictions. The vote would take months. The negotiations would take longer. Yet everyone present understood something important. The conversation had changed. Far away on Nova Harbor, Ryan continued baking bread. Ayla continued helping customers. Neither attended the council session. Neither sought recognition. Yet their actions had reached the highest levels of galactic government. And the effects were only beginning. Because ideas can travel farther than starships. And sometimes the smallest acts create the largest consequences. Change came slowly. The galaxy had spent decades creating barriers. Removing them would never happen overnight. Yet for the first time since the border wars ended, progress began moving in the right direction. The Council's Refugee Assistance Initiative passed after months of negotiations. Not every civilization supported it. Not every government participated, but enough did. Housing programs expanded across multiple sectors. New education grants allowed refugee families to rebuild their futures. Employment agreements connected workers with worlds facing labor shortages. Transportation networks were established to help displaced populations relocate safely and legally. The changes were imperfect, but they were real. Over the next 5 years, millions of refugees found permanent homes. Then millions more. Entire communities that had once existed in temporary shelters became thriving settlements. Children who had grown up surrounded by uncertainty entered schools, universities, and professional training programs. For the first time in years, many survivors could plan for a future instead of simply surviving another day. Nova Harbor changed as well. The station never lost its industrial character. Cargo vessels still filled its docks. Mechanics still worked long shifts. Freight crews still crowded local cafes and restaurants. But one building became famous far beyond the station itself. Ryan Cole's Bakery. Travelers arrived from distant systems simply to see it. Tour groups occasionally appeared during busy afternoons. Journalists continued requesting interviews. Ryan continued refusing most of them. His daily routine remained almost unchanged. He baked bread, served customers, and complained whenever someone called him a hero. The medal remained displayed above the counter, protected inside a simple glass frame. Visitors often stopped to look at it. Some knew Serena Wren's story. Others only knew the phrase that had spread across the galaxy. She offered her last medal for bread. And a human's choice changed history. For Ayla, life moved forward. The attention surrounding her eventually faded, replaced by something she valued far more. Normality. She completed her education through one of the new refugee scholarship programs. Later she entered medical training, inspired by the example her mother had left behind. Years passed. She worked aboard relief ships, then hospitals. Eventually she became a medical coordinator responsible for assisting displaced civilians throughout several sectors. Thousands of refugees passed through programs she helped manage. Many never knew her history. That was exactly how she preferred it. When people thanked her, she usually gave the same answer. Someone helped me when I needed it. As decades passed, newer generations learned about the border wars through history courses rather than personal memory. Yet the story of Serena Wren, Ayla Wren, and a small bakery on Nova Harbor never disappeared. Because sometimes history is not remembered for its battles. Sometimes it is remembered for what people choose to do after the fighting ends. And that lesson would survive far longer than any war. 43 years later, I sat inside the archives of the Bayari Historical Institute, surrounded by records of wars, treaties, revolutions, and political crises that had shaped modern galactic civilization. As one of the last journalists who had witnessed the refugee debates on Unity Nexus firsthand, I had been invited to assist with a historical review of the post-war Reconstruction era. The assignment seemed straightforward. Identify the major events that transformed refugee policy. Document the key political decisions. List the leaders responsible. At first, the answers appeared obvious. Council reforms, economic agreements, interstellar aid programs, government initiatives. The archives contained millions of pages detailing legislation and diplomatic negotiations. Yet as historians examined the evidence, a strange pattern emerged. Every major reform traced back to the same period. Every major public movement pointed toward the same story. Again and again, the records led us back to Nova Harbor. Back to a small bakery. Back to a hungry girl carrying a military medal. I remember reading testimony from delegates who had served during that era. Many admitted the same uncomfortable truth. The statistics never changed their minds. The speeches rarely changed their minds. The public reaction did. People saw themselves in Ayla Wren. They saw dignity reduced to desperation. They saw sacrifice forgotten. And they decided it was unacceptable. One historian asked a simple question during the review. What was the most important decision made during the refugee crisis? The room debated for nearly an hour. Dozens of answers were proposed. None felt complete. Finally, an elderly scholar stood and pointed toward a preserved image hanging on the archive wall. The photograph showed Serena Wren helping civilians board an evacuation transport. Beside it hung another image. Ryan Cole standing behind the counter of his bakery. The scholar smiled. History keeps searching for governments. Sometimes it should look for people. Silence followed. Because everyone understood. The galaxy had spent decades believing history was shaped by admirals, emperors, politicians, and fleets. They were important, but they were not the whole story. Years later, when the official historical summary was finally completed, its closing passage became one of the most quoted texts in modern galactic history. It read, "We believed history was shaped by rulers and armies. We were wrong. One day, a hungry girl offered her last medal for a loaf of bread. A human baker could have taken it. Instead, he chose kindness. That decision changed laws. It changed lives. And it reminded the galaxy that compassion is not weakness. It is one of humanity's greatest strengths. And after all these years, I believe that may be the truest sentence ever written." 30 years after the refugee reforms, Nova Harbor looked very different. New districts surrounded the old industrial sectors. Refugee housing complexes had become thriving neighborhoods. Schools, clinics, and businesses filled areas that had once been emergency shelters. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Ryan Cole's Bakery. The sign had been replaced twice. The ovens had been upgraded 4 times. Entire generations of workers had passed through its doors. But the bakery remained exactly where it had always been. Ryan was old now. His hair had turned gray years earlier, and his movements were slower than they once were. Most mornings, younger employees handled the heavy work while he focused on customers. He preferred it that way. On a quiet evening near closing time, the bell above the door rang. Ryan looked up. A woman entered wearing the uniform of the Galactic Medical Coordination Authority. Several decorations rested on her jacket. Behind her stood 2 young children. Ryan smiled immediately. "Ayla." She smiled back. "Hello, Ryan." The children looked around the bakery with obvious curiosity. "This is the place?" one asked. "The famous bakery?" Ayla laughed. "Yes." Ryan shook his head. "Don't encourage that nonsense." The children ignored him and immediately spotted the framed medal hanging above the counter. For several minutes, they stood staring at it. Finally, the younger child turned toward Ryan. "Is it true?" Ryan raised an eyebrow. "What part?" "The story." Ryan glanced toward Ayla. She simply smiled. "The story is much smaller than people think." The child frowned. "But everyone says you changed the galaxy." Ryan looked around the bakery. At the tables. At the ovens. At the customers finishing their meals. Then he looked back at the medal. "No," he said quietly. "I just gave someone dinner." Outside, ships continued arriving and departing from Nova Harbor. Inside, the bakery remained warm. For Ryan, that was enough. For the galaxy, it never would be. A century after the border wars, few people still remembered the political arguments that had once consumed Unity Nexus. The speeches were archived. The votes were recorded. The legislation remained preserved inside countless government databases. But history had a habit of deciding for itself what truly mattered. On the 100th anniversary of the Refugee Reform Accord, representatives from across the galaxy gathered on Nova Harbor. Not at a government building. Not at a military monument. At a bakery. The original structure had long since been preserved as a historical site. The ovens no longer baked bread, but everything else remained exactly as it had been. The worn wooden tables, the counter where customers once placed their orders, and above it all, protected behind reinforced glass, hung a single medal. Visitors moved quietly through the building. Some were students, some were diplomats, some were descendants of refugees whose families had been saved by the programs created after the crisis. At the center of the crowd stood an elderly woman. Ayla Wren. Time had silvered her hair and softened her features, but people still recognized her instantly. She spent several minutes looking at the medal. The same medal her mother had earned. The same medal she had once tried to exchange for a loaf of bread. A young student approached her carefully. "Excuse me." Ayla smiled. "Yes?" The student hesitated, then asked the question everyone eventually asked. "Why do people still come here?" The answer seemed obvious, yet Ayla took her time. She looked around the bakery, at the visitors, at the medal, at the countless names engraved on memorial walls outside. Then she spoke, because people think history is made by powerful individuals. The student nodded. Isn't it? Sometimes. Ayla's gaze settled on the old counter. But not always. She pointed toward the framed medal. My mother saved lives because she believed it was the right thing to do. Then toward a photograph of Ryan. And Ryan helped a hungry stranger because he believed it was the right thing to do. The student remained silent. Ayla smiled gently. The galaxy changed because enough people decided those choices mattered. Outside, ships crossed the sky above Nova Harbor. Inside, visitors continued arriving. The bakery had become more than a building. It had become a reminder that compassion was not weakness, that dignity had value, that kindness could survive long after wars ended, and that the measure of a civilization was never its fleets, its wealth, or its power. It was how it treated those who had nothing left. That lesson endured, and because it endured, so did the story.